He wasn't just a singer, he was the soundtrack of a revolution. While the world still praises Marvin, Stevie, and James, one voice, gentle yet thunderous, remains criminally overlooked. Curtis Mayfield sang hope into chaos, gave rhythm to resistance, and built a legacy that the industry quietly buried. But why did the man who gave us Superfly, People Get Ready, and an entire catalog of black empowerment fade from the spotlight? Why did the prophet of soul, who turned music into both weapon and salvation, never receive the same recognition as his peers? This isn't just a story about a musician. It's about a genius who transformed gospel into protest, a poet who wrote survival into melody, a revolutionary who carried his people's pain and turned it into timeless. His falsetto was a whisper that thundered, his guitar a sermon no pulpit could contain. Yet somehow, history allowed his name to dim, even as his songs continued to fuel generations. Tonight, we step back into the life of Curtis Mayfield, a child of Chicago's harsh Cabrini-Green projects, who refused to be silent, a leader who gave voice to the voiceless, an innovator who built his own empire, and a survivor who kept creating even when tragedy struck him down. This is the story of genius, resilience, and a legacy left in the shadows. This is Celebrity Underrated, the Curtis Mayfield story. Curtis Lee Mayfield was born on the 3rd of June, 1942, into a world that demanded toughness before tenderness. His first cries echoed inside Cabrini-Green, one of Chicago's most notorious housing projects, a concrete maze of poverty, crime, and broken promises. For most, Cabrini-Green was a place where dreams withered early. For Curtis, it was the crucible that forged a prophet. The soundtrack of his childhood wasn't lullabies but sirens, shouting neighbors, and the muffled prayers of mothers trying to keep their children safe. Yet, woven between the chaos was gospel, the kind of music that rose above cracked walls and leaking ceilings, filling even the darkest corners with light. His mother, Zelda Mayfield, anchored the family with fierce. After separating from Curtis's father, she raised her children alone, relying on the power of the church to hold them together. In her small apartment, hymns weren't background noise, they were survival. Zelda took Curtis to church, and there, beneath the glow of stained glass and trembling voices, his destiny began to take shape. The church choir became his first stage, his training ground, and his refuge. It was also where fate introduced him to another teenager named Jerry Butler. Their voices blended in worship before either boy understood that those harmonies would one day change American music. Curtis's relationship with school, however, was far more fragile. Teachers and textbooks couldn't hold his attention the way rhythm and words did. He was introspective, withdrawn, with thoughts deeper than his age suggested. While his peers chased playground games, Curtis scribbled down lyrics, trying to capture feelings bigger than his small world. By his teenage years, school felt less like a path forward and more like a cage. He dropped out, a decision that could have been fatal in Cabrini-Green. But Curtis didn't spiral into despair or the streets. Instead, he turned to something extraordinary. He taught himself the guitar. With no formal lessons and no mentors, he picked up a second-hand instrument and listened. String by string, chord by chord, he bent the guitar to his will. Instead of tuning it the standard way, he adjusted it to an F-sharp chord. It was unconventional, even rebellious, but it gave him a sound that would later be unmistakably his. His guitar didn't just play notes, it breathed with a spiritual resonance that mirrored the gospel he grew up on. By 16, the outlines of genius were already etched into him. His falsetto voice carried both fragility and fire. His pen dripped with poetry that elevated street life into scripture. His guitar style sounded less like technique and more like testimony. Most importantly, Curtis was awake to the world around him. He saw the injustices, the contradictions, the weight of being black in America. And he understood something few adults dared admit. Silence was not safety, it was surrender. Every element of his childhood, Cabrini-Green's hardships, his mother's faith, the choir's harmonies, his own experiments with the guitar they taught him that music wasn't decoration. It was a weapon, a shield, a lifeline. It could console, but it could also confront. Imagine him in those early years, a boy in a cramped apartment, scribbling lines by candlelight, strumming a guitar tuned in ways no teacher would approve of, humming melodies that felt more like prayers than songs. Most would never have guessed that this quiet, thoughtful teenager was preparing to give voice to an entire... Curtis Mayfield wasn't destined to be another anonymous child swallowed by Cabrini-Green. He was destined to rise above it, not by leaving its struggles behind, but by carrying them with him in every lyric, every chord, every breath of falsetto. His early life was more than a beginning. It was the prophecy of what was to come. A man who refused surrender, a musician who transformed hardship into harmony, and a future icon who would sing the truth others were too afraid to whisper. By the late 1950 seconds, while many teenagers chased Elvis imitations or doo-wop fantasies, Curtis Mayfield was already chasing something deeper: purpose. His meeting with Jerry Butler in the church choir years earlier was about to bear fruit. Butler had formed a fledgling vocal group called the Roosters and asked Curtis to join. Curtis didn't hesitate. He packed his guitar, his notebook filled with lyrics, and alongside Sam Gooden, Richard Brooks, and Arthur Brooks, the Roosters sang harmonies that felt raw but promising. Soon, under new direction and a sharper vision, they transformed into something greater: the Impressions. Their early years were modest, marked by local gigs and small stages, but beneath the surface was potential that couldn't stay hidden for long. Their first major break came in 1958, when Jerry Butler led the group on the song For Your... Its tender devotion and smooth delivery cracked the Billboard Top 20, a rare accomplishment for a young black vocal group. The single announced to the world that the Impressions had arrived. Yet shortly after, Jerry Butler left to pursue a solo career, a move that could have ended the group entirely. For most bands, losing their frontman meant collapse. For the Impressions, it meant Curtis Mayfield stepped into his destiny. He became not only the lead vocalist, but also the group's primary songwriter and creative director. At a time when black artists were rarely allowed to steer their own careers, this was radical. Curtis didn't simply want to continue what Jerry had started. He wanted to create something entirely new: music that didn't just entertain but enlightened. Through the early 1960 seconds, the Impressions honed a sound that was as smooth as silk yet razor-sharp, and tracks like It's All Right, Gypsy Woman, and I'm So Proud showcased their ability to melt hearts with falsetto harmonies and melodic grooves. But beyond the surface beauty, Curtis's lyrics gave the music its soul. He wasn't afraid to write about struggle, inequality, and hope. He understood that their platform could be more than romance; it could be revolution. Then, in 1965, Curtis Mayfield wrote the song that would forever etch his name into history: People Get Ready. It was a hymn. Its lyrics carried spiritual imagery that evoked hope, resistance, and faith. There's a train coming. You don't need no baggage. You just get on board. The song was embraced as an anthem for the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself often quoted it in his speeches, further solidifying its place as one of the most powerful protest songs in American history. Unlike other songs of the era, People Get Ready wasn't angry or violent. It didn't point fingers. Instead, it inspired unity, perseverance, and courage. It gave weary marchers a soundtrack to keep moving, mothers a prayer for their children's future, and America a reminder of its unfulfilled promises. The song reached the top 20 on the charts, but its real success couldn't be measured in numbers. Its true impact was written on the faces of marchers and etched into the soul of a movement. From there, the Impressions leaned fully into their role as musical prophets. Songs like Keep On Pushing, We're a Winner, and Choice of Colors blended Curtis's gospel roots with unflinching political awareness. These weren't just pop records. They were statements, declarations of dignity and resilience. At a time when radio stations were wary of black politics, the Impressions broke through barriers with every harmony. Curtis proved something extraordinary. Soul music could carry more than romance. His falsetto didn't just caress the ear, it cut through complacency. His pen didn't just write lyrics, it wrote sermons. By the end of the decade, the Impressions weren't just another vocal group. They were a movement, a collective voice for change. Yet even as the Impressions thrived, Curtis began to feel restless. The messages he carried, the visions he had, were too vast to be contained within a group. He needed more room, more freedom, and more control. The seeds of his solo career were being sown, and soon he would step forward alone. But make no mistake, The Impressions was where Curtis Mayfield became Curtis Mayfield. In the crucible of that group, he proved that music could be more than entertainment. It could be prophecy. It could be protest. It could be power. By 1970, Curtis Mayfield had climbed to the mountaintop of soul music. The Impressions had given him a voice, a platform, and a loyal following. Yet for Curtis, the group had become both blessing and boundary. He could feel the edges of what was possible within the safety of a harmony group. The messages he carried, the burning truths about racism, inequality, and survival needed more room, more control, more fire. And so, at the very peak of his fame, Curtis did something almost unthinkable. He walked away. Leaving the Impressions was no small risk. For a black artist in the 1,970 seconds, fronting a successful group was security, a rare ticket to steady work and recognition. To abandon that meant stepping into the unknown. But Curtis wasn't chasing security. He was chasing freedom. He wasn't just trying to make music anymore. He was trying to make a statement. His first solo effort, simply titled Curtis, hit the world like a thunderclap. Released in 1970, it was a bold fusion of funk, soul, gospel, and unapologetic black. From the cover alone, Curtis set the tone, standing in profile, arms folded, unsmiling, radiating thought, burden, and purpose. This wasn't a man selling charm. This was a man carrying a message. The album's lead track, Don't Worry, If There's a Hell Below, We're All Going to Go, didn't tiptoe into social commentary, it charged in full force. With its dark, psychedelic funk groove and Curtis's falsetto floating over a storm of paranoia and urgency, the song laid bare the racial, political, and spiritual crises of America. It wasn't background music. It was wake-up music. Curtis wasn't soothing listeners. He was shaking them awake. Then came Move On Up, the album's crown jewel. Unlike the apocalyptic tone of the opener, this track soared with optimism. Driven by irresistible horn arrangements and Curtis's urgent falsetto, it became an anthem of perseverance. It told listeners to rise, to keep climbing despite obstacles, to carry pride like armor. While it didn't dominate the charts the way Motown hits did, Move On Up carved itself into history as one of the great motivational hymns of black pride and resilience. The rest of the album was no less daring. Tracks like If There's a Hell Below and We the People Who Are Darker Than Blue were uncompromising in their honesty. Curtis gave voice to the streets, the struggles, and the systemic failures that others glossed over. He refused to sugarcoat reality. His music didn't ask for permission. It demanded respect. Critics began to realize what fans already knew: Curtis Mayfield wasn't just another soul singer stepping out on his own. He was a revolutionary composer. He had turned the microphone into both pulpit and podium, addressing not just lovers, but an entire community fighting for dignity. And he didn't stop there. In 1971, he released Roots, another deeply political and poetic statement. With songs like Get Down and Beautiful Brother of Mine, Curtis continued to preach unity and perseverance. His falsetto carried the cadence of a preacher, while his guitar spoke truths that politicians dared not utter. By 1973, with Back to the World, Curtis shifted focus to black veterans returning from Vietnam. These were men who had risked everything for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. Curtis gave them a soundtrack for their pain and their return, a reminder that their struggle was not forgotten. Yet perhaps Curtis's most groundbreaking move during this era wasn't even musical. It was business. Determined to free himself and others from the exploitative grip of white-owned record labels, he founded Curtom Records. This was more than a vanity project. It was an empire built on ownership and community. Curtis wasn't just writing and singing. He was producing, publishing, and controlling every aspect of his art. He hired black engineers, musicians, and executives, creating opportunities in an industry that had long shut doors. At a time when Motown was polishing black music for crossover success, Curtis built a space where authenticity reigned. He showed a generation of artists that they didn't need to sell out to speak up. Curtom Records became a blueprint for independence, decades before ownership became a rallying cry in hip-hop and beyond. Through it all, Curtis never lost his balance between the prophet and the performer. His music remained deeply spiritual, deeply political, and deeply personal. In an era crowded with stars, he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing freedom. And in doing so, he redefined what soul music could be. Not just rhythm and melody, but resistance and prophecy. By 1972, Curtis Mayfield had already established himself as more than a soul singer. He was a voice for the voiceless, a prophet armed with a falsetto and a guitar. But what he did next would rewrite the very relationship. He didn't just compose a soundtrack, he turned a movie into a sermon. Hollywood at the time was capitalizing on a new wave of cinema known as blaxploitation. Low-budget films featuring black heroes, flashy cars, gritty urban streets, and pulpy storylines flooded theaters. On the surface, these movies gave black audiences representation they had long been denied. But beneath the swagger and style lurked stereotypes. Pimps, drug dealers, hustlers. Superfly was one such film. It followed Youngblood Priest, a cocaine dealer trying to score big before walking away from the game. The movie drew criticism, even within the black community. Some argued it glamorized crime and fed into the very images white America used to demonize black neighborhoods. But when Curtis Mayfield stepped in, everything changed. He didn't just write background songs for the film. He crafted a counter-narrative, a moral compass that the movie itself lacked. From the haunting opener, Little Child Running Wild, to the piercing critique of Pusherman, Curtis reframed the story. His lyrics didn't glorify the hustler's life. They exposed the despair, the emptiness, the addiction behind the image. He humanized the characters not to celebrate them, but to warn us about the broken system that forced them into cycles of survival and self-destruction. And then came the title track, funky, bold, unforgettable, driven by wah-wah guitar and Curtis's silky falsetto. The song became a cultural bombshell. It sounded like the streets, slick, stylish, dangerous, but it spoke like prophecy. Curtis didn't judge, he explained. He contextualized. He gave depth to what otherwise could have been a hollow tale of drugs and fast money. The brilliance of Curtis's approach was that the soundtrack didn't merely accompany the film, it transcended it. While Superfly the movie ended with a slick escape, Superfly the album left no one unscathed. It challenged audiences to see beyond the glamour and recognize the tragedy. For the first time, a soundtrack wasn't just echoing what was on screen, it was interrogating it. Commercially, the results were staggering. The Superfly album outsold the film itself, going double platinum and dominating the charts. Songs like Freddy's Dead and Superfly became anthems on their own, separate from the movie. Curtis Mayfield had pulled off what no one else had imagined possible, using a Hollywood product as a Trojan horse to deliver a social sermon wrapped in funk and soul. Critics and fans alike began to recognize his genius. Superfly was hailed not only as one of the greatest soundtracks of its era, but also as a turning point in popular music. It proved that a commercial project could still carry conscience, that entertainment could be both profitable and prophetic. Yet true to form, Curtis never basked in the acclaim. For him, art was never about applause. It was about accountability. Superfly cemented his place as a revolutionary composer, someone who could take the tools of an industry designed to exploit and flip them into platforms of empowerment. In the years that followed, countless artists would attempt to capture that same blend of groove and grit, style and substance. Few succeeded. Because Superfly wasn't just, it was Curtis Mayfield's vision of truth, funky enough to dance to, sharp enough to cut through lies, and powerful enough to still echo decades later. With Superfly, Curtis Mayfield didn't just make history, he made a soundtrack for survival. The 13th of August, 1990. The sky above Brooklyn's Wingate Field was moody, restless, filled with dark clouds and distant thunder. Curtis Mayfield, the quiet prophet of soul, stepped on stage prepared to deliver once again the truth that had carried him for decades. The crowd gathered with anticipation, unaware that they were about to witness not just a concert, but a tragedy that would forever alter music history. As Curtis approached the microphone, a powerful gust of wind swept across the stage. In a heartbeat, disaster struck. A massive lighting rig, thousands of pounds of steel and glass, snapped loose and came crashing down directly on top of him. In one horrifying instant, the stage went from sanctuary to nightmare. The impact shattered Curtis's spine at the C3 and C4 vertebrae, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. The man whose guitar had once sung louder than politicians could now no longer lift a finger. The falsetto voice that carried marches and movements was suddenly tethered to a body that refused to move. It was a cruel irony, the prophet silenced not by critics, not by the industry, but by a freak accident. Most artists would have faded into despair. Curtis chose a different path. Through relentless therapy, the support of his wife Altaida and his children, and sheer willpower, he found ways to keep creating. Though he could no longer play guitar or physically produce, his spirit remained intact. In the mid-1,990 seconds, against all odds, he began recording what would become his final album, New World Order. The process was agonizing. Strapped to a specialized bed, Curtis sang while lying flat, delivering one phrase at a time, stopping between lines to catch his breath. Assistants helped him manage his breathing, allowing his fragile body to survive the demands of recording. But despite the pain, the music came. Songs like Back to Living Again and I Believe in You radiated resilience, hope, and faith. Even in total stillness, Curtis's soul moved mountains. His falsetto, now more fragile, carried the weight of a man who had endured too much, yet refused to surrender. But while Curtis fought to keep his voice alive, the music industry, the very machine he had helped shape, slowly turned its back. By the 1,990 seconds, MTV was saturated with flashy pop and polished hip-hop videos. Neo-soul was emerging, built on the very foundations Curtis had laid, yet his name rarely appeared in tributes or retrospectives. Award shows honored legends, but somehow skipped over Curtis Mayfield. Retrospectives praised Motown's golden children Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, while Curtis's name flickered in the background like a signal lost in static. How could the man who wrote People Get Ready, hailed by Rolling Stone as one of the greatest songs of all time, be sidelined in the very history he helped create? Part of it was image. Curtis never played the fame game. He wasn't glossy, he wasn't pop-friendly, and he never cleaned up his politics for mainstream comfort. While his contemporaries flirted with crossover success, Curtis stayed rooted in raw truth, and truth is rarely profitable. Even after the accident, when he returned to the studio in conditions that bordered on miraculous, the industry offered little support. There were no massive benefit concerts, no large-scale tribute albums, no Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award handed to him while he was still breathing. Instead, Curtis fought largely in silence, his efforts championed more by the streets and the underground than by the suits and executives who... And yet, ironically, his influence was everywhere. Public Enemy, Ice Cube, Lauryn Hill, Kanye West all sampled his sound, echoing his words, building their art on the foundation Curtis had laid. Neo-soul artists like D'Angelo and Erykah Badu carried his spirit into a new generation. Curtis Mayfield's fingerprints were all over the charts. They just weren't attached to his name. It was a strange injustice. Being too important, while others received standing ovations, Curtis remained a prophet in the shadows. The industry may have neglected him, but the culture, those who truly listened, kept his spirit alive. In tragedy, Curtis revealed his greatest truth, that even when his body was broken, his music remained unbreakable. As the 1,990 seconds unfolded, Curtis Mayfield's life became a testament not just after the devastating stage accident in 1990 left him paralyzed from the neck down. Every day was a battle. Simple tasks most take for granted, eating, dressing, moving, were now impossible without assistance. Yet Curtis refused to retreat into silence. He remained visible, granting interviews from his wheelchair, speaking softly yet powerfully about hope, music, and perseverance. To younger musicians, he became more than a legend. He was living proof that even as his body betrayed him, his mind never wavered. "There's still music in my mind," he once said. Those words became both mantra and prophecy. His greatest act of defiance came in 1996 with the release of New World Order. Recording under unimaginable conditions, strapped to a bed, singing in short bursts between breaths, Curtis crafted an album that was less farewell and more survival manual. Songs like Back to Living Again and I Believe in You pulsed with faith and resilience. Each note carried the weight of a man who had seen the edge of despair but chose hope instead. It wasn't the sound of defeat, It was the sound of a prophet refusing to go quietly, but behind the courage was immense struggle. Curtis battled chronic pain, infections, and the slow, relentless complications of diabetes. His family, especially his wife, Altaida, and their children stood by him, carrying the enormous weight of the emotional toll was crushing, but Curtis remained gracious. He never complained, never lashed out. Even confined to a chair, he radiated dignity. Still, the silence of the industry was deafening. While peers received lavish tributes, major reissues, and lifetime achievement ceremonies, Curtis often stood outside the spotlight he deserved. To many, it felt like the music business was content to quietly forget him, even as countless artists continued to borrow from his sound. The injustice was not lost on Curtis, but he rarely voiced bitterness. He knew his work spoke louder than any award could. By the late 1992, his health had deteriorated further. Diabetes worsened, leaving him vulnerable to infections and exhaustion. The once tireless performer was now engaged in a private war with his body. Yet even then, he chose to keep giving. He mentored, he encouraged, and he believed that as long as his voice existed. On the 26th of December, 1999, just one day after Christmas, Curtis Mayfield passed away at his home in Roswell, Georgia. He was 57 years old. His death came quietly, surrounded by loved ones not on stage, not in the glare of cameras, but in peace. The prophet who had spent a lifetime singing for others finally rested. Almost immediately, the tributes poured in not from the industry executives who had so often overlooked him, but from the artists and communities who had felt his influence in their bones. Stevie Wonder called him a voice of reason and love. Aretha Franklin described him as the truest soul brother of us all. Carlos Santana called him a spiritual warrior. Lauryn Hill, D'Angelo, Erykah Badu, and The Roots all honored him as mentor, blueprint, and foundation. Curtis Mayfield's final years were marked by unimaginable struggle, but also by unimaginable strength. He may have left the world quietly, but his voice, fragile yet fierce, continues to echo. For a man who spent his life writing survival into melody, his death was not the end. It was the passing of a torch, a reminder that truth-tellers may be neglected, but they are never forgotten. When Curtis Mayfield passed in 1999, his voice may have quieted, but his music had already been reborn in a new generation. Long before record labels organized tribute albums, the streets had been keeping him alive. Nowhere was his spirit more present than in hip-hop. For young rappers growing up in the shadow of Reaganomics, crack epidemics, and broken housing projects, Curtis's records were like survival guides left behind by an elder. His lyrics about systemic oppression, poverty, and resilience were already truth-telling sermons. All hip-hop had to do was turn up the volume. Public Enemy sampled him. Ice Cube borrowed his sound. The Notorious Big nodded to his style. And Kanye West looped the soaring strings of Move On Up to power his hit Touch the Sky, turning Curtis's words of perseverance into an anthem for Lauryn Hill, herself a torchbearer of socially conscious music, channeled Curtis's energy in both her songwriting and delivery. In countless beats and verses, his falsetto whispers and orchestral grooves became the hidden backbone of a genre built on defiance. But Curtis's influence didn't stop with rap. In the 1990 seconds, a new wave of artists reimagined soul music, stripping it back to its raw spirituality, and they called it neo-soul, and at its core was the DNA of Curtis Mayfield. D'Angelo, Erykah Badu, Jill Scott all carried his legacy forward. They embraced vulnerability, spirituality, and social awareness in ways that directly traced back to Curtis's mix of gospel, funk, and protest. You could hear it in the intimate confessions, the grooves that felt like sermons, the refusal to separate love songs from political. In many ways, Curtis was the invisible producer in every neo-soul session, his fingerprints stamped on the very foundation of the movement. Unlike Motown's polished crossover formula, Curtis had always believed authenticity mattered more than marketability. Neo-soul artists inherited that philosophy, creating music that sounded like community rather than product. They were heirs to a blueprint Curtis had drawn decades earlier when he built Curtom Records to prioritize ownership and integrity. What makes this influence even more striking is that Curtis never demanded credit. While others fought for headlines and awards, Curtis focused on creating truth. That humility meant his name was often absent from mainstream conversations, but his spirit never left the culture. Hip-hop and neo-soul artists may not have always shouted his name, but their work shouted his vision. Think of it this way. Every time a rapper spits a verse about systemic inequality, every time a neo-soul singer delivers vulnerability without compromise, Curtis is there. He is the whisper beneath the beat, the ghost in the studio, the elder blessing the track. And yet, this is the paradox of Curtis Mayfield. He was everywhere and nowhere all at once. His songs echoed across radio, clubs, protests, and playlists, yet his face rarely appeared on murals or tribute stages. His music lived on not through industry promotion, but through cultural necessity. People needed Curtis Mayfield's truth, so they kept resurrecting it, remixing it, reinterpreting it. In hip-hop samples and neo-soul hymns, Curtis Mayfield became immortal. Even when his name was missing from the credits, his soul remained in the sound. For an artist often left in the shadows, this may be the most powerful legacy of all, to be so deeply woven into the DNA of music that forgetting him is impossible. For much of his life, Curtis Mayfield lived in the tension between reverence from the streets and neglect from the industry. But after his passing in 1999, recognition long overdue finally began to arrive. It wasn't immediate, nor was it enough to match his contributions, but it signaled that history could no longer ignore him. In 1991, while still alive, Curtis had been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Impressions. But the true measure of his solo genius came only after tragedy. In 1999, just months before his death, the Hall of Fame announced that he would be inducted again, this time for his solo career. In 2000, he was honored posthumously, a bittersweet recognition of the groundbreaking work he had done. 2 years later, the Grammys finally bestowed the Lifetime Achievement Award, acknowledging him as one of the most important architects of modern music. It was a tribute that should have been his to hear, but at least it carved his name more deeply into the annals of music history. Yet what truly resurrected Curtis wasn't plaques or trophies. It was the continued presence of his music in culture. Protest playlists leaned on "People Get Ready" as a hymn of resilience. Spike Lee's films carried echoes of his sound. HBO's The Wire used Curtis's spirit like a ghost, narrating the struggles of the inner city. And when movements like Black Lives Matter rose decades after his heyday, his words once again found their place on the front lines. Artists organized tribute concerts that went beyond performance. They preached his gospel. In 2000, The Roots, Lauryn Hill, Stevie Wonder, and others gathered to honor him, not with spectacle, but they reminded the world that Curtis Mayfield had not just written songs, he had written scripture for survival. Still, despite these honors, Curtis never fully ascended to the pantheon of mainstream legends like Marvin Gaye or Stevie Wonder. His name remained quieter, his face less likely to appear on murals or retrospectives, but perhaps that was fitting. Curtis was never about spotlight. He was about service, using music as a weapon of truth. The rediscovery of his work in the 2000 seconds and beyond has been less about correcting history and more about affirming what the culture always knew. Curtis Mayfield was never gone. He was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Today, when an artist dares to fuse groove with conscience, when a soundtrack dares to challenge the story it accompanies, when a singer whispers truth that thunders louder than applause, Curtis's spirit is present. Late recognition may have come, but his true reward lies in the generations that keep carrying his torch. Curtis Mayfield's story begins where hope was least expected, inside the walls of Cabrini-Green, and ends with his whisper still echoing across generations. He was the soundtrack of a revolution, the prophet of a people, the quiet storm who moved mountains with falsetto and faith. Yet somehow, his name does not shine as brightly as it should. History crowned Marvin, Stevie, and James, while Curtis, who gave us People Get Ready, Superfly, and an entire catalog of survival hymns, was too often left in. But what do we truly owe Curtis Mayfield? Is it enough to stream his records, to nod at his influence, to let his samples live inside hip-hop and neo-soul? Or does he deserve more, his name spoken in the same breath as the giants, his story told with the reverence of a prophet who never stopped giving, even when his body gave out? Curtis Mayfield wrote more than songs. He wrote survival. He wrote resistance. His music carried the weight of marches and sermons, of mothers praying and children dreaming. He gave voice to the voiceless and dignity to the disregarded. And when tragedy struck, when the lights literally fell upon him, he still found a way to sing. His legacy is not measured in plaques or sales. It is measured in every artist who dares to tell the truth, in every protest where his lyrics resurface, in every soul who finds strength in his falsetto. Curtis Mayfield may have been underrated, but he was never irrelevant. So we leave you with this. What's your favorite Curtis Mayfield track? Which lyric still speaks to you today? Drop it in the comments, we want to hear from you. Because remembering Curtis Mayfield is more than nostalgia, it's justice. This has been Celebrity Underrated, the Curtis Mayfield story. And Curtis Mayfield will never be forgotten.